Have you ever believed something so deeply that it felt like common sense, only to realize later that it was never truth at all, just repetition dressed up as certainty? For generations, the world has been taught to measure strength through symbols. Bigger budgets, louder voices, more stars on a uniform. And quietly, almost politely, another belief followed behind that thinking, that some nations are born to lead, and others are meant to follow. The Philippines, despite its history of sacrifice, faith, and resilience, was often placed into that second category. Not openly mocked, not directly insulted, just underestimated. People spoke in whispers, as if the conclusion had already been agreed upon by everyone who mattered. Filipino soldiers were described as courageous but limited, disciplined but dependent, loyal but never decisive. Even allies repeated this narrative without malice, convinced it was simply how the world worked. Four-star generals from powerful nations were treated as the final word on capability and command, their opinions rarely challenged, their assumptions rarely tested. When they arrived in smaller countries for joint exercises, it was expected they would teach, direct, and correct. Rarely did anyone imagine they might learn something instead. Then came a moment that did not fit the script. It was not a speech, not a press conference, not a viral headline. It began quietly, inside a military exercise that was supposed to be routine. A controlled environment, a friendly challenge. An American four-star general, respected, decorated, and confident, arrived believing this would be another demonstration of superiority. A chance to observe, evaluate, and move on. Across from him stood Filipino Special Forces, men shaped not by theory, but by terrain. Not by comfort, but by constant uncertainty. Soldiers who had trained in jungles that swallowed sound, under heat that punished hesitation, with faith stitched into their discipline. The challenge was framed as a test of tactics, 5 engagements, 5 scenarios. The outcome, in the general's mind, felt predetermined. No one said it out loud, but the expectation hung heavy in the air. This was how the world had always worked. This was how power was measured. What happened next forced a pause that no briefing could explain, because this was not just about a score. It was about a worldview colliding with reality, about assumptions meeting lived experience, about a nation long seen through the lens of limitation, revealing something else entirely, something sharper, something humbling. At the center of this story are Filipino commandos whose names rarely appear in headlines, and a general whose confidence would soon be tested not by arrogance, but by truth. Their encounter did not unfold with shouting or spectacle. It unfolded with precision, silence, and results that no one expected, but no one could deny. And as the first engagement ended, something subtle shifted. Not on the battlefield, but inside the minds of those watching. A question replaced certainty. A doubt crept into long-held beliefs. Because when reality refuses to obey reputation, the world is forced to reconsider what it thinks it knows. And that was only the beginning. Before the first result was even recorded, the emotional distance between the two sides was already clear. On one side stood officers shaped by technology, satellites, simulations, and doctrines refined in classrooms and war rooms. On the other were Filipino Special Forces, whose education had been written directly onto their bodies by humidity, hunger, and years of operating where maps often lied. They did not talk much. They listened. They observed. They adjusted their gear with movements so practiced they felt almost prayerful. The American general watched closely, not with hostility, but with the confidence of someone who believed he had already seen the limits of what was possible. His career had been forged through deserts, cities, and command centers. He trusted data, he trusted systems, and most of all, he trusted history. a history that told him smaller forces eventually revealed their weaknesses under pressure. The jungle, he assumed, would only slow everyone equally. But for the Filipino commandos, the jungle was not an obstacle. It was memory. It was home. Every sound carried meaning. Every broken branch was a sentence. Every pause in the wind told a story. They had learned long ago that survival did not belong to the strongest or the fastest, but to those who listened longest. The first scenario began without ceremony. Orders were given, timers started, and within minutes, something felt off. The Americans advanced with precision, clean formations, confident movement. The Filipinos disappeared. Not tactically, almost spiritually. They melted into terrain the way water slips into soil. There was no rush to engage, no dramatic confrontation, only patience. As minutes stretched, frustration quietly built. Communication channels buzzed. Adjustments were made. Drones scanned. Sensors searched. And still, nothing. The jungle remained silent. Too silent. Then, contact. It came not as an explosion, but as realization. A flank compromised. A simulated objective neutralized. The first engagement ended faster than expected, not with chaos, but with clarity. No one cheered. The Filipino soldiers simply reset, faces calm, eyes steady. To them, this was not victory. It was execution of discipline. The general did not speak immediately. He reviewed footage. He asked questions. He expected to find a mistake, a fluke, something explainable. Instead, he found patterns, patience, timing, an understanding of human behavior that no manual could teach. This was not improvisation. This was mastery. The second scenario unfolded differently. New tactics, new assumptions, yet the outcome echoed the first. The Filipino team anticipated movement before it happened. They seemed to know where pressure would build before it arrived. It was as if the jungle itself was guiding them. By the third engagement, the mood had shifted. Confidence gave way to curiosity. Authority leaned into observation. The general no longer watched from above. He watched closely, quietly, as one belief after another loosened its grip. This was not about losing. It was about confronting something deeply uncomfortable, the realization that excellence does not always announce itself loudly. And as the score quietly moved towards something unthinkable, a deeper tension took hold. Because if this continued, it would not just challenge a strategy, it would challenge an entire worldview. By the time the fourth engagement approached, the atmosphere no longer felt instructional. It felt reverent. Conversations softened, movements slowed. Even the air seemed heavier, not from heat, but from awareness. The American general no longer stood with arms crossed and expectations intact. He stood with hands behind his back, leaning slightly forward, the posture of a man trying to understand rather than judge. This scenario was meant to restore balance. Night operations, limited visibility, technology brought back into the equation. On paper, this was where experience with advanced systems would reassert itself. The jungle after sunset was supposed to be unforgiving to everyone equally. But the Filipino Special Forces did not treat night as an enemy. They treated it as an old companion. As darkness settled, they moved with a quiet confidence that could not be taught in months or even years. They communicated without words, through timing, spacing, instinct. Their discipline did not come from fear of command, but from trust in one another. Each step was measured, each pause intentional. They did not rush to dominate the terrain. They allowed the terrain to carry them. What struck the observers most was not aggression, but restraint. Opportunities appeared, and they waited. Threats emerged, and they dissolved. It was not flashy. It was effective. The engagement unfolded like a slow tide, inevitable and controlled. When it ended, the outcome required no explanation. The silence said enough. That was the moment the general exhaled, long and quietly. Not in frustration, in recognition. He asked to walk the ground afterward. No cameras, no entourage, just boots on soil. A Filipino operator pointed out details most would miss: a bend in a route, a pattern of insects, the way sound traveled differently after midnight. The general listened, not as a superior, but as a student. For the first time, he was not comparing. He was absorbing. The fifth and final engagement arrived without the usual tension. Something had already been decided internally, even if the numbers were not yet official. The Filipino team approached it with the same humility they had shown from the start. No swagger, no celebration, just duty. And once again, the result followed the pattern. 5 engagements, 5 outcomes, no ambiguity. But the true turning point was not the score. It was the quiet moment afterward, when the general addressed the assembled forces. His voice did not carry command. It carried honesty. He spoke of assumptions, of how experience can sometimes blind rather than enlighten, of how he had arrived believing he was there to evaluate, only to realize he was there to learn. He looked directly at the Filipino soldiers and nodded slowly. In that nod was something rare: respect without qualification. Not because they had won, but because they had revealed a deeper truth: that strength is not always loud, that mastery often wears humility, and that a nation shaped by struggle can produce warriors whose greatest weapon is understanding. In that moment, the jungle was no longer just a setting. It was a witness. And the Philippines was no longer underestimated. It was undeniable. After the final engagement ended, there was no celebration in the traditional sense, no raised voices, no triumphant gestures. What followed, instead, was something far more powerful: stillness. The Filipino Special Forces gathered quietly, some wiping sweat from their faces, others kneeling briefly with heads bowed. A short prayer passed between them, almost instinctive, not performed for anyone watching, but offered in gratitude. For safety, for discipline, for one another. It was a moment so simple that many observers missed it, but the American general did not. He watched as these men, who had just delivered a result that shook assumptions at the highest level, behaved as if nothing extraordinary had happened. No ego, no demand for recognition. Only calm, only brotherhood, only faith. That was when something inside him shifted more deeply than any after-action report ever could. In the days that followed, the general chose to stay longer than scheduled. Not for meetings, but for conversations. He sat with Filipino operators during meals, listening to stories that never made it into official briefings. Stories of growing up with little, of training while supporting families, of missions conducted not for medals, but because communities depended on them. He learned how many of them carried rosaries inside their uniforms, not as superstition, but as grounding. A reminder that strength without humility is empty. What struck him most was their joy. Not the loud kind, but the quiet resilience that smiled even in hardship. They laughed easily. They teased one another. They spoke about danger without bitterness. For men who had lived close to uncertainty, they carried an uncommon peace. It unsettled him, then inspired him. He began to understand that what he had witnessed in the jungle was only the surface. The true advantage of these soldiers was not terrain or tactics. It was values. Faith that steadied the mind, community that erased fear, discipline rooted not in punishment, but in purpose. These men did not fight to prove themselves superior. They fought to protect something sacred. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air cooled, the general stood quietly at the edge of the camp. He later admitted that this was the moment that stayed with him the longest, watching Filipino soldiers share food, joke softly, and prepare for another day with the same seriousness they brought to battle. There was no switch between warrior and human. They were both, at all times. That night, he spoke words he had never expected to say. Not to the media, not to superiors, but to himself. I have never seen this anywhere else. Not in elite academies, not in advanced commands, not in nations with limitless resources. What he had seen in the Philippines was something rarer than power. It was balance. Strength guided by humility, skill anchored in faith, courage softened by compassion. The transformation was complete, not because he had been defeated, but because he had been awakened. And in that awakening, the Philippines revealed itself not as an underdog, but as a quiet standard the world had overlooked for far too long. When the general finally departed, there were no formal speeches waiting for him, no press lines eager for sound bites. He left quietly, the way he had learned to appreciate things in the Philippines. But he did not leave unchanged. Long after the jungle faded behind him and the familiar structures of power returned, something followed him home. A realization that refused to be filed away like a report, a truth that stayed uncomfortably alive. He understood now that what happened was never just about 5 engagements or a perfect score. It was about perspective, about how easily the world confuses resources with resolve, technology with wisdom, volume with value. The Philippines did not merely challenge him tactically, it challenged the way he understood strength itself. And once that understanding shifted, it could not be undone. In private conversations later, he would speak differently, with care, with humility. He would say that the Filipino soldiers did not just win an exercise. They reminded him why service exists in the first place. To protect life, not ego. To serve something greater than personal recognition. To remain human, even when trained for violence. Those words did not circulate widely. They did not need to. Their power lived in how they reshaped decisions, attitudes, and respect. For the Filipino soldiers, life continued as it always had. Training resumed, duties called, families waited at home. There were no parades, no headlines proclaiming dominance. And that, perhaps, was the most Filipino part of all. Victory without noise, excellence without demand, faith without performance. But something subtle had changed in the space between nations, a quiet recalibration. Those who witnessed the exercise carried the story forward, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in moments of silence when assumptions were challenged. And slowly, the old narrative began to crack. The idea that the Philippines was merely resilient, merely faithful, merely brave, started to feel incomplete. Because what the world saw in that jungle was not an underdog rising for a moment. It was a nation revealing what it had always been. A people forged by hardship yet unbroken. Disciplined without cruelty. Strong without arrogance. Guided by faith that does not ask to be admired, only lived. In a world increasingly loud with division and dominance, the Philippines offered a different message. That power rooted in values lasts longer than power rooted in fear. That humility can coexist with mastery. That true strength often kneels in prayer before it stands in battle. This story is not meant to glorify conflict. It is meant to honor character, to remind Filipinos of what they already carry and to show the world what it has too often overlooked. If even a 4-star general can walk away humbled, reflective, and grateful, then perhaps the rest of us can pause as well. Because sometimes, the most powerful force on earth is not the one that demands recognition, but the one that quietly earns it. And in that quiet, enduring way, the Philippines stands tall.